If you've got a gravel driveway, a gravel path, or a gravel bed anywhere on your property, you already know the problem I'm about to describe because it happens to every single one of us eventually. 1 week, the gravel looks clean. 2 weeks later, there's a dandelion pushing up through it, like the rocks aren't even there. And right behind it, a whole row of little green sprouts you didn't plant and definitely didn't want. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what I use to kill every one of those weeds, right down to the root, without a single drop of it ever reaching the soil underneath that gravel. No harsh commercial herbicide, no staining, nothing that leaches down and kills the good microbial life in the ground beneath your driveway, which, believe it or not, is still there, working away, even under 2 inches of crushed stone. Stick around, because I'm also going to tell you about the mistake almost everyone makes the first time they try something like this. The one that either wastes the whole batch or, worse, ends up killing something you actually wanted to keep. That part matters just as much as the recipe itself, so don't skip ahead. But first, let's talk about why gravel, of all surfaces, seems to grow weeds like it's trying to. It doesn't feel like it should make sense. There's no soil sitting right there on the surface. It's just stone. And yet gravel beds are some of the worst weed magnets on an entire property. And once you understand why, the fix makes a lot more sense too. Gravel isn't actually a barrier against weeds. It's more like a greenhouse for them. Wind carries seeds in constantly, and those seeds settle into the gaps between the stones, where they're protected from birds, protected from being blown right back out, and sitting in a little pocket that traps moisture from dew and rain far longer than open soil would. Underneath that gravel layer, there's almost always compacted native soil, and no matter how many inches of stone you put down, weed roots are relentless about finding their way down into it. A dandelion taproot can push through gravel that would stop a person from digging with a hand trowel. Given enough time and enough gaps, weeds don't just tolerate gravel. They actually thrive in it because it holds warmth, holds moisture, and gives them something to anchor a root system against. I learned this the hard way on my own property a few years back. I'd put down a gravel path along the side of the house, the kind of project that looks great for about a month and a half before reality sets in. By the second summer, that path had more green in it than gray. I tried pulling the weeds by hand for a while, which works technically until you realize you're spending an hour every weekend just to keep even, and the second you miss a week, they're right back. Before I landed on the method I'm about to show you, I actually went through a handful of other approaches. And I think it's worth mentioning them briefly, because knowing what didn't work for me might save you some time if you've already tried one of these yourself. I tried a propane weed torch first, the kind that lets you scorch weeds directly with an open flame. It does work, and there's something satisfying about it, but it's slow going one weed at a time. It's genuinely risky to use near anything flammable, which a lot of gravel beds sit uncomfortably close to, whether that's a wood fence, dry mulch, or a stack of firewood, and I never felt entirely relaxed using open flame that close to the house. I also tried boiling water straight from a kettle, poured directly onto individual weeds, which is a method a lot of people swear by. It does kill the top growth on contact, but I found I needed to refill the kettle constantly for anything beyond a handful of weeds, and by the time I'd carried enough boiling water out to treat a decent stretch of path, my arms were more tired than the weeds were dead. I tried a commercial weed killer next, the kind you can buy at any hardware store, and it did kill the weeds. It also left a strange, permanent-looking discoloration on some of the lighter-colored stones, and I never felt entirely comfortable about my dog walking across that path an hour after I'd sprayed it, no matter what the label claimed about drying time. That discomfort is really what sent me looking for something else, something I could make myself, understand every ingredient in, and use without worrying about what was happening to the ground beneath the stones. What I landed on, after a fair amount of trial and error, is a simple 3-ingredient mix: horticultural-strength vinegar, a small amount of citrus oil, and a splash of plain dish soap. That's it. No exotic ingredients, nothing you can't find at a regular store, and nothing that requires any special handling beyond basic care, since the vinegar in this mix is considerably stronger than the vinegar sitting in your kitchen pantry. Here's why each piece of that combination actually matters, because understanding the mechanism is what lets you use it correctly, rather than just following a recipe blindly and being disappointed when it doesn't work as well as you expected. Regular household vinegar is around 5% acetic acid, which is honestly too weak to do much more than mildly stress a weed's foliage. Horticultural vinegar, which you can find at most garden centers or order online, runs 20 to 30% acetic acid, which is a completely different level of strength. At that concentration, acetic acid works by rapidly drawing moisture out of plant cells on contact, essentially desiccating the leaf tissue it touches within hours. That's why this is called a contact herbicide rather than a systemic one. It doesn't travel down into the root system the way something like glyphosate does. It burns whatever green tissue it actually touches, and that's the entire mechanism. The citrus oil's job is to break down the waxy outer coating called the cuticle that most weed leaves have. That waxy layer is a natural defense that helps plants resist water loss, but it also means plain vinegar tends to beat up and roll right off a leaf without fully soaking in. The D-limonene in citrus oil dissolves that waxy layer almost immediately, which lets the vinegar actually penetrate the leaf surface instead of sliding off onto the gravel beneath it. And the dish soap is a surfactant, which is a fancy way of saying it reduces the surface tension of the liquid so it spreads out and clings to the narrow blade of a weed leaf instead of forming droplets that run off. Without it, you'd be spraying most of your mixture straight down between the gravel stones instead of onto the actual plant you're trying to kill, which is both wasteful and exactly the kind of runoff that would eventually reach the soil underneath. Put those three things together, and you get a mixture that's genuinely aggressive against the leaf tissue it lands on, but that stays almost entirely on the surface of the plant itself, evaporates within a few hours in the sun, and never soaks down through several inches of gravel into the soil below in any meaningful quantity. That combination of speed and containment is exactly why this works as a gravel-specific method in a way that broadcast spraying a lawn or a garden bed simply wouldn't. It's worth taking a moment to explain why that distinction actually matters, beyond just wanting to avoid stained stone. Most people picture the ground underneath a gravel driveway or path as essentially dead, compacted dirt with nothing going on down there, but that's not really accurate. Even under several inches of crushed stone, there's an active layer of soil life immediately below, earthworms, beneficial fungi, and countless microorganisms that break down organic matter and keep the surrounding soil healthy, especially if that gravel bed happens to run alongside a garden, a flower bed, or established trees whose root systems extend well beyond their visible canopy. Systemic herbicides that leach down into that layer don't just kill the target weed's roots. Depending on the product and the concentration, they can suppress or disrupt that underlying soil biology for a period of time afterward, which is a real consideration if you're trying to keep the rest of your yard healthy and chemical-free. A contact method that essentially never reaches that layer at all sidesteps the question entirely, which is really the core appeal of doing it this way. Let's get into exactly how I mix and apply it because the ratios and the timing both matter more than people expect. A quick note on sourcing before we get to the ratios themselves. Horticultural vinegar isn't sold in the same aisle as the vinegar you'd use for cooking, so if you go looking for it at a regular grocery store, you likely won't find it there. Garden centers, farm supply stores, and hardware stores with a decent lawn and garden section typically carry it, usually labeled specifically as horticultural vinegar, or sometimes as a higher percentage cleaning vinegar, and it's also widely available online if your local stores don't stock it. I'd recommend checking the acetic acid percentage on the label before buying, since products marketed vaguely as extra strength vinegar can sometimes still be well under the 20% threshold that actually makes a meaningful difference for this method. Citrus oil concentrate is even easier to find, usually sold either in the cleaning products aisle or alongside other natural pest and weed control products, and a single small bottle lasts through a surprising number of batches since the amount needed per gallon is quite small. For a standard pump sprayer, I use 1 gallon of horticultural vinegar, about 1 ounce of citrus oil concentrate, and roughly 1 tablespoon of plain dish soap. I want to stress the word plain there, because scented or antibacterial dish soaps sometimes contain additives that can interfere with how well the mixture clings to leaf surfaces, and a basic unscented soap works better than anything fancier. Mix all three together gently in the sprayer. Avoid shaking it too vigorously since that creates excess foam that makes spraying messier than it needs to be, and you're ready to go. Timing is where most people get this wrong, and it's the single biggest reason someone tries a mixture like this once, gets mediocre results, and assumes it just doesn't work as well as advertised. This needs to go on during full direct sun, ideally the hottest part of the day, and ideally on a day with no rain in the forecast for at least 6 hours afterward. The heat from direct sunlight dramatically speeds up how fast the acetic acid desiccates the leaf tissue, and spraying on an overcast or cool morning will give you a noticeably weaker result, sometimes barely wilting the weed instead of killing it outright. I made this mistake myself the first time, spraying early on a cloudy morning because that's when I happened to have free time, and came back the next day almost convinced the whole batch had been a failure. The following weekend I sprayed the exact same weeds under full early afternoon sun, and most of them were visibly wilted and browning within 4 hours. Apply it as a direct targeted spray onto the weed's foliage itself, not as a broad, sweeping spray across the whole gravel surface. This is the part that actually keeps it out of the soil underneath. You're not trying to saturate the gravel. You're trying to coat the leaves of the specific weed you're targeting, getting the underside of the leaves where you can, since that's often where the waxy cuticle is thinnest and the mixture penetrates fastest. A small handheld pump sprayer with an adjustable nozzle set to a narrow stream rather than a wide mist gives you far more control over exactly where the liquid lands, which matters both for effectiveness and for keeping it away from anything you don't want to kill. I typically work in sections rather than trying to cover the entire path or driveway in a single pass. On a longer stretch of gravel, I'll break it into roughly 10-foot segments, treat each one thoroughly before moving to the next, and this also gives me a natural way to track which sections I've already covered on a given day, since a freshly sprayed weed doesn't always look visibly different in the first few minutes. I also keep a small notebook, low-tech as that sounds, where I jot down roughly which week I treated which section, since that ends up being far more useful for planning my next round than trying to remember it from memory a month later. One detail that took me a while to figure out is that the angle of the nozzle matters more than I initially expected. Spraying straight down onto a weed from directly above tends to let a fair amount of the mixture run off the leaf surface and drip down between the gravel stones. Angling the sprayer slightly so the stream hits the leaf at more of a glancing angle and catches the underside as well as the top noticeably improves how much of the mixture actually stays on the plant rather than running off toward the ground. Within about 2 to 4 hours on a hot sunny day, you'll start to see visible wilting. By the next morning, most annual weeds will be fully browned and crisped. Tougher perennial weeds with established root systems, things like dandelions or thistle that have been growing for more than a season, will usually show the same rapid browning on the top growth. But you'll often see new sprouts emerging from the same root within a week or two, since a contact herbicide doesn't kill the root system the way a systemic product would. That's not a failure of the method. It's simply the trade-off for something that doesn't travel down into the soil at all. The fix is straightforward. Reapply directly to any regrowth as soon as you see it. And after 2 or 3 rounds, most established roots exhaust themselves and stop sending up new growth entirely, since each round of top growth being burned off forces the root to spend stored energy regenerating leaves rather than expanding. Before we get into the common mistakes, it's worth talking about how the timing of the year itself changes how this performs, because the season you're spraying in matters almost as much as the time of day. Spring is when most people first notice their gravel getting overrun, since that's when everything wakes up at once and weeds that were barely visible in March seem to triple in size by late April. Early spring applications tend to work well against young, tender seedlings, which have thinner leaf cuticles and less established root reserves, meaning they often succumb to a single treatment more completely than they would later in the season. The catch is that spring days aren't always reliably hot and sunny, so you may need to wait for the right weather window rather than treating on a fixed schedule. Summer is when this method performs at its absolute best, simply because you've got consistent, intense heat and direct sun working alongside the vinegar to speed up desiccation. If you're only going to commit to a few treatment days across an entire year, the peak of summer, on the hottest, sunniest afternoons you can find, will give you the fastest, most visible results with the least amount of repeat spraying needed. Fall is trickier. By that point in the season, a lot of the perennial weeds you're dealing with have had months to build up substantial root reserves, and shorter days with cooler temperatures mean the contact burn works more slowly and less completely than it did in July. I still treat visible growth in fall, mostly to prevent late-season seed drop that would otherwise give you an even bigger mess to deal with come spring, but I don't expect the same dramatic overnight results I get in peak summer. And in winter, in most climates, there's simply not enough active growth or warmth for this to be worth attempting at all. That's the season to leave the sprayer in the shed and instead focus on physically clearing out any dead growth left over from fall, which also happens to make it easier to spot new seedlings the moment they emerge the following spring. The tougher weed regrowth cycle I mentioned isn't unique to this method either. It's simply how any purely contact-based approach works, natural or synthetic. What matters is that after 2 or 3 rounds, most of the weeds along a typical gravel path or driveway stop coming back with any real vigor, and the ones that persist tend to be the handful of genuinely established perennials that would give any method a hard time. To give you a sense of what this actually looks like in practice, the side path I mentioned earlier used to take me a solid hour of hand pulling every single weekend just to keep it looking presentable, and even then it never looked genuinely clean, just less overgrown than the week before. Since switching to this method, my typical maintenance pass takes 15 to 20 minutes every 3 to 4 weeks during the growing season, and the path actually looks the way it did the week it was first installed, rather than a slightly less bad version of overgrown. That difference, going from constant low-grade upkeep that never quite finishes the job to occasional thorough treatment that actually clears things out, is really what sold me on sticking with this method long-term rather than going back to pulling weeds by hand or reaching for a commercial spray. I want to walk through a few mistakes now because these are genuinely the difference between someone who tries this once and gets great results and someone who tries it once, gets a lukewarm outcome, and writes the whole method off. The first mistake is spraying on a windy day. Even a light breeze can carry this mixture onto nearby plants you didn't intend to treat. And since it's a non-selective contact herbicide, it will damage the foliage of literally anything green it lands on, ornamental plants included. Pick a calm morning or early afternoon, and if there's any plant close to the gravel edge that you want to protect, either avoid spraying near it entirely or shield it with a piece of cardboard while you work. The second mistake is spraying weeds that have already gone to seed. If you've got a dandelion with a full, fluffy seed head sitting right there, spraying it can actually disturb the plant enough to release seeds you'd rather have stayed put. Pull or clip off any obvious seed heads by hand first, dispose of them separately, and then spray the remaining foliage. It's a small extra step, but it prevents you from accidentally reseeding the exact area you're trying to clear. The third mistake is expecting one application to solve everything permanently, especially in gravel specifically. Because gravel beds are constantly receiving new windblown seeds, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't a one-and-done treatment the way it might be for a single isolated weed in a garden bed. Think of it as ongoing maintenance rather than a permanent fix. Most people who use this regularly end up doing a full pass every 3 to 4 weeks during the growing season, spot treating anything new as it appears, rather than expecting a single spray day in spring to keep the whole path clear until fall. The fourth mistake, and this one surprised me the first time I encountered it, is applying it heavily right at the base of larger, more established weeds with thick, woody stems, expecting it to work as fast as it does on soft-leaved annuals. Woody-stemmed perennials have thicker cuticles and more stored energy in their root systems, and while this method will still burn back the top growth, it typically takes more repeat applications over a longer stretch to fully exhaust a well-established root than it does for something like chickweed or crabgrass. Patience matters more with those tougher plants, and knowing that going in prevents the frustration of assuming the method has failed, when really it's just a slower process for that particular weed. The fifth mistake is diluting the mixture to try to stretch it further, especially once you realize how much horticultural vinegar a full gallon batch actually uses up over a season. I understand the instinct, since horticultural-strength vinegar costs more per gallon than the vinegar you'd buy for cooking, but cutting it with extra water drops the effective acetic acid concentration below the threshold where it reliably desiccates leaf tissue, and you end up with a mixture that mostly just stresses weeds temporarily rather than killing them outright. If cost is a real concern, it's better to make a smaller batch at full strength and treat a smaller section thoroughly than to stretch a full batch thin across more ground than it can actually handle. The sixth mistake is storing leftover mixture in a sealed metal container. The acetic acid in horticultural vinegar is corrosive enough over time to react with certain metals, which can both degrade your container and, in some cases, affect the mixture itself. I keep mine in a dedicated plastic pump sprayer that never gets used for anything else, labeled clearly and stored somewhere my kids and pets don't have casual access to, the same precaution I'd take with any concentrated cleaning product around the house. There are a few questions I get asked constantly about this, so let's go through them directly. Is it safe around pets and kids? Once it's dried, which typically takes a few hours in full sun, there's nothing hazardous left on the surface. The concern during application is the same as with any concentrated vinegar solution. It can irritate eyes and skin on direct contact while it's still wet, so I'd keep pets and kids off the treated area until it's visibly dry, same as you'd do with any spray-on product. Because it's fundamentally food-grade vinegar, citrus oil, and dish soap, there's no lingering chemical residue building up in the soil the way there can be with some synthetic herbicides. Will it stain the gravel? In my experience, no, and this was actually one of my biggest concerns going in, given what happened with the commercial product I mentioned earlier. Because the mixture is targeted directly at the weed foliage rather than broadcast across the whole surface, and because it evaporates within hours rather than sitting and soaking in, I've never seen any discoloration on stone from using this, even on lighter colored gravel that showed staining almost immediately with the commercial alternative. Does it kill grass if it drifts onto the lawn edge? Yes, unfortunately, the same way it kills any other green plant tissue it touches. This is not a selective herbicide that knows the difference between a weed and your lawn. If your gravel path runs alongside grass, be deliberate about your spray angle and avoid overspray onto the lawn edge or use a piece of cardboard as a simple barrier while you work that section. How does this actually compare to a synthetic herbicide like glyphosate? The honest answer is that they work through completely different mechanisms, and each has a real trade-off. Systemic products like glyphosate travel down into the root system and can kill even deeply established perennial weeds in a single application, which this method generally can't do on the first try. But those systemic products also linger in the soil for a period of time, which is exactly the concern that sent me looking for an alternative in the first place, particularly for a gravel bed sitting right next to a vegetable garden the way part of my own path does. This method trades some of that one application power for the peace of mind of knowing almost nothing is soaking down into the ground beneath the stones. How often do you actually need to spray a section once it's under control? Once you've knocked back the initial overgrowth, which usually takes 2 or 3 rounds over the first month, maintenance treatment drops off considerably. I do a full walkthrough of my own gravel path roughly every 3 to 4 weeks during peak growing season, spot treating whatever new growth has popped up since the last pass, which usually takes me 15 minutes or less once the worst of it is already cleared. Does this work on other surfaces like mulch beds, patios, or in between paving stones? It works well on paver joints and patio cracks for the same reason it works on gravel. Those are surface-level growing spots where a contact herbicide can reach the weed without much risk of deep soil contact. Mulch beds are a different situation, since mulch holds moisture and often has actual soil sitting much closer to the surface underneath it, which changes the calculation somewhat. I still use this method on mulch beds occasionally for a stubborn weed, but I'm more careful about exactly how much I'm applying and where, since there's less of a buffer between the surface and the living root systems of whatever I do want growing there. What does this actually cost compared to buying a commercial product? A gallon of horticultural vinegar typically runs somewhere in the range of $15 to $25 depending on where you buy it, and a bottle of citrus oil concentrate, which lasts through many batches, since you only need about an ounce per gallon, adds another few dollars per treatment when averaged out. All told, I figure each full gallon batch costs somewhere around $20, which treats a fairly substantial stretch of gravel when applied as a targeted spot spray rather than a broad soak. That's genuinely comparable to, and sometimes a bit more than, a jug of concentrated commercial herbicide up front. But for me, the trade-off has always been about what's happening to the soil and what I'm comfortable with my kids and dog walking across, not really about shaving a few dollars off the cost per application. Can you make a bigger batch and store it for later use? You can, and I usually do mix a larger batch at the start of the season rather than measuring out a fresh one every single time. Stored in a sealed plastic container away from direct sunlight, the mixture stays effective for at least a few months, though I'd avoid keeping it much longer than that, since the citrus oil component can lose some of its potency over extended storage, which weakens how well the vinegar penetrates the leaf's waxy cuticle. Is it safe around metal fence posts or structures that might be sitting in the gravel? Yes. This has never caused any issue for me with galvanized fence posts, metal edging, or similar hardware sitting in or near treated gravel. The concentration and exposure time involved in a quick spot spray is nowhere near enough to meaningfully corrode metal hardware, unlike, say, storing the concentrated mixture itself in a metal container over a long period, which is a completely different level of prolonged exposure. There's one more thing I want to address directly because I think it's an honest and fair question. Is this actually as effective as the video title makes it sound, or is that some exaggeration for the sake of getting a click? My honest answer is that the title is accurate, but it deserves a little context. Kills every weed is true in the sense that direct, properly timed contact with this mixture will kill essentially any weed's top growth, without exception, regardless of species. What the title doesn't spell out, because there's only so much you can fit in a few words, is that some tougher, more established perennial weeds will require multiple rounds of treatment rather than a single spray to fully exhaust the root system. That's not a failure of the method. It's simply how a contact herbicide works by nature as opposed to a systemic one, and I'd rather explain that clearly here than let anyone feel misled after their first application doesn't permanently solve a decade-old dandelion problem overnight. Why go to the trouble of mixing this yourself instead of just buying a natural weed killer off the shelf? You certainly can, and there are decent premixed options out there now. But most of them use the same basic 5% household strength vinegar as their base, diluted further with water, which in my experience produces noticeably weaker results than mixing your own with true horticultural strength vinegar. Making it yourself also means you know exactly what's in it, with no added preservatives or fragrance ingredients that might affect how well it clings to a leaf surface, and it usually works out considerably cheaper per gallon than the pre-made version, once you're treating a decent-sized area regularly throughout a full growing season. I'll be honest about one more thing before we wrap up, because I think it's worth saying plainly, rather than letting this video oversell what it can do. If you're dealing with a truly massive weed problem across a large gravel driveway, one that's gone unchecked for several full seasons, this method is going to take real, repeated effort to bring back under control. It's not a miracle single-day fix for that kind of situation. Where it genuinely shines is regular maintenance, catching new growth early and often, and keeping a path or driveway clear without ever having to worry about what's happening in the soil 3 inches beneath the stones, or about a pet walking across it an hour later. That, to me, is really the whole point of doing things this way. There's something appealing about a solution built entirely from ingredients you can name, that you understand the mechanism of, rather than a bottle with a long list of chemical names and a set of precautions on the label that leave you a little uneasy every time you use it. It's not always the fastest option. It's not always the single most powerful option against a truly stubborn established root system. But it's the option that lets you treat the surface without ever having to think twice about what's happening underneath it. And for a gravel path that sits right alongside a garden bed or a spot where kids and pets are running around regularly, that trade-off has been worth it for me every single time. Looking back at where this whole thing started with a single overgrown side path and a bottle of commercial herbicide that left me uneasy every time I used it, I think what actually changed for me wasn't just finding a recipe that worked. It was shifting how I thought about yard maintenance in general, away from looking for the single most powerful product on a shelf and toward understanding what's actually happening at a chemical level, so I could make an informed choice about the trade-offs rather than just trusting a label. That shift has carried over into a lot of other parts of how I take care of this property, not just the gravel path. And if there's a bigger takeaway from this video beyond the specific recipe, it's probably that one. Understanding the mechanism behind a method is what actually lets you adapt it, troubleshoot it, and trust it, rather than just hoping it works exactly the way a video told you it would. If you try this on your own gravel, I'd genuinely like to hear how it goes, especially if you're dealing with a particularly stubborn weed that's been giving you trouble for a while, since different plants do respond somewhat differently to this method, and I'm always curious to hear what other people are running into. Let me know in the comments what you're up against, and I'll do my best to answer directly, since this kind of feedback is honestly how I've refined the ratios and the timing over the past few seasons to begin with. And if this is the kind of practical ingredient level approach you want more of, rather than the vague, oversimplified version of a tip like this that gets repeated everywhere without any real explanation of why it actually works, subscribing is the best way to make sure the next one actually reaches you. I go through the reasoning behind every method I share here, not just the recipe itself, because I think understanding why something works is what actually lets you troubleshoot it yourself when your own situation doesn't match exactly what's on screen. Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through, from the very first weed pushing up through the gravel to this last thought right here. I know it ran a good bit longer than a quick tip usually does, and I genuinely appreciate you giving it the time. Go get that gravel path looking the way it did the day it went in, and I'll see you in the next one. One very last note, since I know a few of you will ask in the comments regardless, I'm not a licensed horticulturist or a chemist, just someone who's spent several seasons refining this on my own property and talking through the reasoning with people who know the science better than I do. If you're treating a large commercial area, working around sensitive plantings you can't afford to lose, or dealing with a local climate and soil type meaningfully different from mine, it's always worth doing a small test patch first and adjusting from there rather than assuming my exact ratios will translate perfectly to every yard everywhere.